The discovery at Pearl Harbor. December 13th, 1941. 0900 hours. Pearl Harbor Naval Station, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander John B. Earl, intelligence officer for the Pacific Fleet, sat in a requisitioned office that still smelled of smoke and fuel oil, reviewing witness statements from the attack 6 days earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he read the 15th account describing the same impossible thing. A mess attendant, a black sailor restricted by regulation to serving food in cleaning quarters, had manned anti-aircraft guns aboard the battleship West Virginia and fired at enemy aircraft for 15 minutes straight. "This can't be accurate," Earl muttered, reaching for another folder. But there it was again, in the statement of Ensign Victor Delano. The Negro mess attendant fired the starboard gun with considerable effect. And again, from Lieutenant Frederick White. "I observed Mess Attendant Miller at the gun, maintaining fire throughout the attack, despite having no training on the weapon." What Lieutenant Commander Earl didn't know was that the impossible action he was documenting would force the United States Navy to confront a truth it had spent decades denying: that the color of a man's skin had nothing to do with his capacity for courage, competence, or combat effectiveness under fire. The mathematics were staggering. Of the approximately 100,000 men serving in the United States Navy in December 1941, roughly 4,000 were black. Of those 4,000, exactly 0 were assigned to combat ratings. 100%, all 4,000 men, were restricted to the messman branch, serving as cooks, stewards, and attendants. The Navy's Bureau of Personnel maintained detailed statistics. Black sailors could serve food, clean quarters, shine shoes, and press uniforms. They could not, according to official policy dating back to 1919, serve in any capacity involving weapons, navigation, engineering, or command. The ratio was absolute: 4,000 to 0. Every single black sailor in the fleet was categorized as non-combatant. The Navy's Officer Training Manual, revised as recently as 1939, explicitly stated that men of the colored race were temperamentally unsuited for combat roles and should be restricted to duties appropriate to their capabilities. Yet here, in 15 separate witness statements, was documented proof of a mess attendant who had seized an anti-aircraft gun and fought back against an attacking enemy force. The scale of the contradiction was unprecedented. For 22 years, since the end of the First World War, the Navy had maintained this absolute racial division. Thousands of black men had served, and not one had been permitted to fire a weapon in defense of his ship or his country. The institutional certainty was complete, the policy unquestioned, the assumptions treated as self-evident fact, until December 7th, 1941, when a 22-year-old mess attendant from Waco, Texas, had done what the Navy insisted was impossible. Doris Miller had enlisted in the Navy on September 16, 1939, at the recruiting station in Dallas, Texas. He was 19 years old, the third of 4 sons born to Henrietta and Connery Miller, sharecroppers who had moved to Waco seeking better opportunities. Miller stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 190 pounds, most of it muscle-built from working the fields and playing fullback for Moore High School's football team. His enlistment papers listed his occupation as farm laborer and his education as 8 years. At the Naval Training Station in Norfolk, Virginia, Miller received 6 weeks of basic training. Unlike white recruits who learned seamanship, gunnery, engineering, or communications, Miller and the other black recruits in his company learned to make beds with hospital corners, serve meals without spilling, and address officers with proper deference. His service record from Norfolk showed proficiency ratings in table service, uniform pressing, and quarters maintenance. There was no mention of weapons training, damage control, or naval tactics. Such training, for men of his race, was considered unnecessary. Miller's first assignment was to the ammunition ship USS Pyro, where he served in the officers' wardrobes as a mess attendant third class. His duties involved waking officers, serving their meals, cleaning their quarters, and maintaining their uniforms. The work was hard, the hours long, the pay $96 per month. Less than white sailors of equivalent time in service who earned $126. On January 2, 1940, he transferred to the battleship USS West Virginia, one of the fleet's most powerful vessels, mounting 8 16-inch guns and capable of hurling 2,700-pound shells 21 miles. Aboard West Virginia, Miller became the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, a title that brought him a measure of respect from the crew, but no change in his official duties. He still served meals in the officers' wardroom, still collected soiled laundry, still shined shoes. In July 1940, he attended a brief rotation at the Secondary Battery Gunnery School aboard the battleship Nevada, but only to serve food to the officers and sailors receiving actual gunnery training. He returned to West Virginia on August 3, 1940, carrying a service record that listed him as proficient in food service and excellent in uniform maintenance. Under weapons qualifications, his record was blank. This was the expected pattern. Captain Mervyn Bennion, West Virginia's commanding officer, was known as a fair man who treated his crew well, but he followed Navy regulations without question. The ship's black sailors, numbering 47 out of a crew of 1,800, worked in the galleys and wardrooms. The white sailors manned the guns, operated the engines, navigated the ship, and stood watch. This division seemed natural, proper, and permanent. Lieutenant Commander Earl knew this system intimately. He had served in the Navy for 16 years, attended Annapolis, commanded a destroyer in the Atlantic. He had eaten meals served by black stewards, had his uniforms pressed by black attendants, never questioned the arrangement. The policy seemed to work. The fleet functioned smoothly. Black sailors performed their assigned duties adequately. White sailors performed theirs. The system appeared to prove itself through its own operation. But now, reading through the witness statements from West Virginia, Earl encountered something that challenged every assumption. The attack had begun at 7:55 on Sunday morning, December 7th. Miller was in the officer's wardroom, 3 decks below the main deck, collecting laundry from the sleeping quarters. He heard the general quarters alarm, followed immediately by the sound of explosions. Like every sailor aboard, he had a battle station, a specific location where he was required to report during combat. Miller's station was the anti-aircraft battery magazine amidships, where his assigned duty was to pass ammunition, the only role in the weapon system considered appropriate for a mess attendant. He ran through the ship's passageways toward his station. Ensign Delano's statement described seeing Miller in the corridor. The mess attendant was moving quickly but without panic, following proper procedure for reaching his battle station. But when Miller reached the anti-aircraft magazine, he found it destroyed. The first wave of Japanese torpedo bombers had struck West Virginia with 6 torpedoes along the port side. One had exploded directly adjacent to Miller's battle station, killing the sailors assigned there and rendering the magazine inaccessible. With his assigned station destroyed, Miller did what Navy regulations required. He reported to the nearest officer for reassignment. He found Lieutenant Commander Dwyer Johnson on the main deck, directing damage control efforts. Johnson's statement recorded his decision. The mess attendant appeared physically strong and calm under fire. I assigned him to assist with moving wounded personnel. What followed was documented in multiple witness statements, each adding details to an emerging picture of sustained heroism. Miller moved through the burning ship, the deck slick with fuel oil and blood, carrying wounded men to aid stations. Bosun's mate, second class Leslie Short, later testified, "I saw the colored boy carry 3 men, one after another, from the boat deck to the forecastle. He wasn't running, but he wasn't hesitating either. Each man he moved weighed 160, 170 pounds at least, and he carried them like they were children." At approximately 8:10, Captain Bennion was struck by shrapnel from a bomb that exploded on the nearby USS Tennessee. The shrapnel tore through his abdomen, leaving him mortally wounded but conscious. Miller, working nearby, immediately went to the captain's aid. Ensign Delano witnessed what happened next. Miller showed no hesitation. He moved directly to the captain, got his arms under him, despite the captain's protests that he should attend to others, and began carrying him toward the aid station. The captain was a large man, 6 feet tall, 200 pounds. Miller carried him as if he weighed nothing. Miller later recalled feeling a tremendous shock while carrying Bennion, strong enough that he thought West Virginia herself had exploded. The blast was actually from USS Arizona, exploding 400 yards away when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine. The explosion killed 1,177 men instantly and sent a pressure wave that knocked sailors off their feet across the harbor. Miller, holding Captain Bennion, kept his footing and continued moving. He carried Bennion first to the forecastle, then to the bridge, searching for a protected location. But the ship was being torn apart. 7 torpedoes had struck the port side, flooding numerous compartments. The ship was settling rapidly, listing 12 degrees to port. Fires burned across 3 decks. The main battery was inoperative, the secondary batteries mostly unmanned, the anti-aircraft guns firing sporadically as their crews were killed or driven from their stations. On the bridge, Miller helped lay Captain Bennion in a position where medical personnel could reach him, though everyone present understood the wound was mortal. Then Miller returned to the main deck, where he spent the next 20 minutes pulling wounded sailors from the wreckage, throwing ropes to men in the water, hauling them aboard. Pharmacist's mate third class Wilbur Carlyle documented this phase. "I counted 6 men the mess attendant pulled from the water. He worked steadily, without stopping. His uniform was soaked with oil and blood, but his movements remained controlled and purposeful." At approximately 8:35, Lieutenant Frederick White made a decision that would crack open the Navy's racial certainty. Finding himself on the main deck with 2 unmanned Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns, their crews killed or wounded, White called for anyone who could load ammunition. Miller responded. White's statement described the moment. "I observed the mess attendant move to the ammunition locker without instruction, select the appropriate magazines, and begin loading the port gun. His movement suggested familiarity with the weapon, though I knew he could not have received training." What White didn't realize was that Miller had watched. For 18 months aboard West Virginia, as the ship's guns had been cleaned, maintained, test-fired, and drilled, Miller had watched. While serving meals to gunnery officers, he had listened to their discussions of firing solutions and ammunition types. While cleaning the gun galleries, he had observed the weapons being stripped and reassembled. The Navy had never trained him to fire a gun, but it had placed him in proximity to guns for 18 months. And Miller had learned through observation what he was prohibited from learning through instruction. With the guns loaded, White prepared to man them himself. But he was needed elsewhere. The bridge was calling for officers. Men were trapped below decks. The ship was sinking. White made a calculation in that moment, documented in his statement. "I observed that the mess attendant had successfully loaded both weapons. I had no one else available to fire them. I made the decision to order him to engage enemy aircraft until I, or another qualified gunner, could relieve him." Miller took position behind the port gun. He later recalled, "I'd watched the others with these guns. I knew you pulled the charging handle back, aimed through the sight, and pressed the trigger. Lieutenant White told me to fire at any Japanese plane that came within range." Warrant Officer Frederick Falk was on the bridge when Miller opened fire. His statement provided detail. The colored sailor began firing at approximately 8:40. I watched him through binoculars as I was coordinating the ship's damage control. He maintained steady fire for approximately 15 minutes, tracking aircraft as they made their attack runs. His fire appeared accurate, though I could not confirm hits. Most notably, he showed no panic, no wild spraying of ammunition. He fired in controlled bursts, following each target through its attack run. The experience Miller described later was one of clarity. "It wasn't hard," he said in an interview 2 months after the attack. "I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns. I guess I fired her for about 15 minutes. I think I got one of those Jap planes. They were diving pretty close to us." Whether Miller actually downed an aircraft remains unconfirmed. What is beyond dispute is that he maintained accurate fire against attacking enemy bombers while his ship was sinking, while fires raged around him, while the Pacific Fleet burned. He fired until all ammunition for both guns was exhausted. Only then did he abandon the weapons and return to helping move wounded men. At 9:05, with West Virginia settling firmly onto the harbor bottom, the order came to abandon ship. Miller was among the last to leave, helping injured sailors into the boats that had come alongside. Ensign Victor Delano, who had observed Miller's actions throughout the morning, noted in his statement, "The mess attendant remained calm and effective from the first explosion until we abandoned ship. His behavior was exemplary and contradicted every assumption I had held regarding the combat effectiveness of colored sailors." That final sentence, buried in a routine after-action statement, was the crack in the dam. Lieutenant Commander Earl rose from his desk and walked to the window. Outside, across Pearl Harbor, salvage crews were working on the sunken battleships. West Virginia was there, settled on the bottom, her superstructure still visible above water. 7 torpedoes, 1,100 crew saved, 106 dead, and 1 mess attendant who had done the impossible. He returned to his desk and began compiling the statements into a coherent report. As he worked, the implications grew clearer. If Miller could fire an anti-aircraft gun effectively without training, what else could black sailors do given the opportunity? If he could remain calm and effective while his ship sank, what did that say about the Navy's doctrine regarding racial temperament? If he could carry wounded men, man guns, and inspire the respect of white officers, what justified keeping 4,000 black sailors in the galleys? The questions were dangerous. They challenged not just Navy policy, but the social order of the entire nation. In 1941, racial segregation was law in much of America. The military services were segregated. The Red Cross segregated blood donations. The question of whether black Americans could serve effectively in combat roles was considered settled, answered not by evidence, but by assumption. But here was evidence: 15 witness statements, a ship's log, a combat action that could not be denied. Earl wrote carefully. He documented Miller's actions chronologically, including every witness statement, every verified fact. He made no recommendations, drew no conclusions. He simply reported what had occurred. But he knew what the report implied, and he suspected it would cause trouble. He was correct. The report reached the desk of Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, on December 17th. Kimmel, dealing with the catastrophic aftermath of the attack, the loss of 2,400 men, the destruction of 8 battleships, set the report aside for later consideration. It eventually reached the Navy Department in Washington on January 9, 1942, where it was reviewed by Captain Harold Train, head of the Bureau of Navigation's Personnel Division. Captain Train read the report 3 times. His marginal notes, preserved in the National Archives, show his struggle. Verify all witness statements. Confirm identity of subject. Review regulations regarding recognition for this situation. The regulations regarding this situation were clear about medals and commendations for heroism. They were silent on what to do when the heroism was performed by someone. The regulations insisted should not exist in that context. Train forwarded the report to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox with a covering memo dated January 23, 1942. The attached report documents actions by Mrs. Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, aboard USS West Virginia during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The actions described are extraordinary and deserving of recognition. However, the subject's rating and race present complications regarding appropriate acknowledgement. Knox read the report. Like most senior Navy officials, he had never questioned racial policies. They seemed to work. The fleet functioned. But the evidence before him was undeniable. More troubling, rumors about a colored sailor who manned guns at Pearl Harbor were already circulating. If the Navy didn't address this officially, the story would take on exaggerated dimensions. What Knox didn't yet realize was that the story was already beyond Navy control. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of America's leading black newspapers, had received letters from sailors who had witnessed Miller's actions. On January 24, 1942, the Courier ran a front-page story, "Mystery Hero at Pearl Harbor." The story reported that a colored mess attendant manned guns and shot down enemy planes, though it didn't yet have Miller's name. The paper demanded that the Navy identify the sailor and award appropriate recognition. Other black newspapers picked up the story. The Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Norfolk Journal, and Guide. Each ran articles demanding information. Letters poured into Navy headquarters. Black churches organized petition campaigns. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People issued a statement calling for the unnamed sailor to receive the Medal of Honor. The pressure created a crisis for Navy leadership. Acknowledging Miller's heroism meant acknowledging that black sailors could perform in combat roles. Ignoring Miller's heroism risked a public relations disaster and suggested the Navy valued racial policy over military valor. The situation forced a reckoning the Navy had avoided for decades. On March 7, 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier published Miller's name, obtained from a sailor who had served with him. The story ran under the headline, "Doris Miller, Mess Attendant, Hero of Pearl Harbor." It included details of his actions and called for him to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Senator James Meade of New York, reading the coverage, introduced Senate Bill 2280 on March 13th, recommending Miller for the Medal of Honor. Meade's speech on the Senate floor was explicit. This brave man deserves recognition not only for his heroism, but as a symbol of the potential contributions of all Negro Americans if given the opportunity to serve their country fully. The Navy Department faced a decision. The Medal of Honor required acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty in combat. Miller's actions were undoubtedly heroic, but they occurred while he was following orders to assist with anti-aircraft guns. More problematically, awarding the Medal of Honor would create enormous pressure to open combat roles to black sailors, a change the Navy's leadership opposed. Secretary Knox reviewed the case personally. His handwritten notes, dated March 24th, reveal his reasoning. Actions clearly heroic. However, Medal of Honor typically requires sustained combat action or extraordinary tactical achievement. Subjects' actions, while brave, occurred during defensive fire on own ship. Recommend Navy Cross as appropriate recognition. This allows acknowledgement of valor without implications regarding combat role eligibility. The decision infuriated black activists and liberal politicians. The NAACP issued a statement calling the Navy Cross Award inadequate and insulting. The Pittsburgh Courier ran an editorial titled "Second-Class Heroism," arguing that white sailors had received the Medal of Honor for similar actions. Pressure mounted through April. President Franklin Roosevelt, sensitive to the political implications and facing increasing need for manpower as the war expanded, made the final decision. On May 11, 1942, he approved the Navy Cross for Miller. The citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing and in the face of serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge." The ceremony occurred on May 27, 1942, aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Admiral Chester Nimitz, now Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, personally pinned the Navy Cross on Miller's uniform. Nimitz's statement at the ceremony was carefully worded. "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race. And I'm sure the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Nimitz's phrasing was diplomatic but revealing. First time, and his race acknowledged the racial barrier being cracked. Others, similarly honored, suggested recognition might extend to other black sailors, but there was no mention of policy changes, no hint that black sailors would be allowed into combat ratings. The Navy was honoring Miller while attempting to contain the implications of his actions. The containment strategy failed. Photographs of the ceremony appeared in newspapers nationwide. Life magazine ran a 4-page spread. Black newspapers published special editions. Miller became famous, a symbol of potential unlocked by necessity. His image appeared on recruiting posters. The Navy, somewhat desperately, sent him on a war bond tour, where he spoke at rallies in 20 cities, raising over $6 million. At each stop, Miller was asked about his experience. His answers were consistent and modest. "I just did what anyone would do. I saw the guns, I knew how they worked from watching, so I fired them." But audiences heard something more. They heard evidence that ability transcended the limitations imposed by law and custom. They heard proof that courage was not a racial characteristic. The tour reached Waco, Texas, on November 23, 1942. Miller's first return home since enlisting. 10,000 people, black and white, lined the streets as his motorcade passed. The mayor proclaimed it Doris Miller Day. Black churches held special services. White civic leaders, who had overseen segregated schools and public facilities, praised Miller's patriotism. The contradictions were glaring and unacknowledged. Miller himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Friends from Waco later recalled that he spoke little about Pearl Harbor, preferring to discuss his hope to return to his ship and his crew. "This recognition is nice," he told his former high school football coach. "But I'm just one sailor. There are thousands like me who'd do the same if given the chance. That's what needs to change." On December 1, 1942, Miller was promoted to mess attendant first class, elevation within the segregated rating structure that carried no increase in authority, but brought his pay to $108 per month. He returned to duty at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Washington State in May 1943, where he was assigned to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay. On June 1, 1943, he received another promotion to ship's cook third class, a slight expansion of role, but still within the service branch that confined black sailors. Liscombe Bay, a small carrier hastily converted from a merchant hull, deployed to the Pacific in October 1943. Miller served in the galley, still preparing meals and serving officers, still excluded from combat roles despite his proven ability and national recognition. The ship participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign, supporting the invasion of Tarawa Atoll in November. At 5:10 in the morning on November 24, 1943, Liscombe Bay was steaming near Butaritari Island when Japanese submarine I-175 fired a single torpedo. The torpedo struck the carrier's starboard side near the aircraft bomb magazine. The detonation was catastrophic. The bomb magazine exploded, the ship broke apart, and she sank in 23 minutes. Of her crew of 916, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was among the 644 men lost. Multiple survivors reported seeing him on deck when the explosion occurred, but no one saw him afterward. The sea was covered with burning oil. Men screamed for help in the darkness. Rescue vessels searched for hours, but found no trace of Miller among the survivors pulled from the water. His parents in Waco received notification that he was missing on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. The letter from the Navy Department expressed hope that he might have survived, but offered no specifics. The family waited for news that never came. On November 25, 1944, Miller was officially declared presumed dead. The irony of the dates was lost on no one who followed the story. Miller had won the Navy Cross on December 7, 1941. His parents learned he was missing on December 7, 1943. The calendar seemed to mark the trajectory of his brief fame and long erasure. Lieutenant Commander John Earl, who had compiled the first report on Miller's actions, learned of his death while serving aboard a destroyer escort in the Atlantic. He wrote in his personal diary, dated December 10, 1943, "Miller lost at Tarawa. Fate seems particularly cruel. This sailor proved himself in combat, received the Navy's second highest decoration, yet still served in the galley while lesser men commanded guns. We honored him enough to make him a symbol, but not enough to let him be what he'd proven he could be. What a waste. What a damning comment on our institution." Other officers who had witnessed Miller's actions expressed similar sentiments privately, though few did so publicly. The Navy's official position remained unchanged. Black sailors were restricted to service roles. Miller's heroism was acknowledged as exceptional, an individual case that proved nothing about collective capability. The barrier he had cracked temporarily on December 7, 1941, had been carefully rebuilt. But the crack widened despite official resistance. Black newspapers kept Miller's story alive, citing him in editorials demanding integration of the armed forces. Civil rights organizations used his example to challenge segregation policies throughout the military. The Navy, sensitive to criticism and facing enormous manpower needs, began making incremental changes. In January 1944, the first black sailors were admitted to general service ratings, though segregated training continued. By war's end, the Navy had reluctantly opened most ratings to black sailors, though integration remained partial and resistance remained strong. The broader transformation was gathering force. The disconnect between American rhetoric about fighting for freedom and American practice of racial discrimination became increasingly difficult to justify. Black veterans returned from the war having proven themselves in combat. They demanded recognition, opportunity, equality. The evidence from Pearl Harbor, from Italy, from France, from the Pacific was overwhelming and undeniable. President Harry Truman, reviewing reports on racial integration in the military, received a briefing that included Miller's story. Truman's marginal notes on the document, dated June 1948, showed his conclusion. If a mess attendant can man guns and win the Navy Cross, then race clearly has nothing to do with military capability. Integration is militarily sound, morally necessary. On July 26, 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the United States Armed Forces. The order didn't mention Doris Miller, but his actions had contributed to the chain of evidence that made segregation impossible to defend. What he had done on December 7, 1941, firing an anti-aircraft gun he was never trained to use, remaining effective while his ship sank, contradicted the entire premise of racial separation in the military. The Navy had tried to contain the implications by awarding him the Navy Cross while maintaining segregation. But evidence has a way of overwhelming policy. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In 1941, 4,000 black sailors served in the Navy, 0 in combat ratings. By 1945, over 165,000 black sailors served, 58,000 in general service ratings. By 1950, after integration, black sailors served in every rating, commanded ships, earned commissions. The transformation that began with one mess attendant manning 2 guns cascaded through an entire institution, proving that barriers of race were artificial, maintained by custom rather than necessity. The mathematics of capability, so long obscured by the mathematics of discrimination, became undeniable. Miller had fired an anti-aircraft gun effectively without training. Dozens of black sailors, given training, proved equally effective. Hundreds more demonstrated competence in every rating. The ratio reversed. From 4,000 black sailors in 0 combat roles to over 100,000 black sailors in every role the Navy required. The correlation between race and capability that policy assumed simply did not exist in reality. The revelation extended beyond the Navy, beyond the military. If the assumption about racial capability was false in warfare, perhaps it was false everywhere. If segregation in the military served no functional purpose beyond enforcing hierarchy, perhaps segregation in schools, in housing, in employment similarly served only to maintain an unjust social order. The evidence from Pearl Harbor, amplified by evidence from every theater of World War II, contributed to the intellectual foundation for the civil rights movement that would transform American society. The paradigm shift was total. What the Navy had insisted was impossible, Miller had demonstrated was possible. What society had insisted was natural. The war had demonstrated was constructed. The system that appeared permanent in 1941 had crumbled by 1950, undermined by accumulated evidence that individuals had been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Yet, the transformation came too late for Miller himself. He had proven his capability, earned recognition, symbolized potential. But he still served meals when he died at age 24 in the waters off Tarawa. The Navy honored him, but did not let him be what he had proven he could be. He became a symbol of change, but did not live to see the change completed. The final irony was preserved in the Navy's official casualty records. Miller was listed as Ship's Cook, 3rd Class Doris Miller, his rating reflecting the service branch that had confined him. The citation for his Navy Cross described him manning guns with courage and effectiveness. The disconnect between what he was permitted to be and what he had proven himself capable of being was documented in official records. a permanent reminder of institutional blindness. Today, visitors to the National Museum of the United States Navy in Washington can see Miller's Navy Cross displayed alongside his photograph and the citation describing his actions. School groups gather around the exhibit. A Navy docent explains what happened on December 7, 1941. The children ask questions. Why was he only a cook? If he could fight, why couldn't he train to fight? Why did they restrict him? The docent's answer is careful and historically grounded. Those were the policies of the time. The Navy believed that only white sailors should serve in combat roles. Doris Miller proved that belief was wrong, but it took years for the institution to change. His courage at Pearl Harbor and the courage of thousands like him helped end segregation in the military. A child asks, "Did they change fast enough for him?" The docent pauses. No. The Navy honored him, promoted him slightly, sent him on a bond tour. But they still kept him in the galley. He died serving food while other men manned the guns he had proven he could fire. The recognition came, but the real change came too slowly. The museum preserves more than medals. It preserves the questions Miller's story forces us to confront. How many others were prevented from contributing their full capability by artificial barriers? How much talent was wasted by institutional blindness? How many years of injustice continued because evidence that should have been overwhelming was dismissed or contained? How long did it take for obvious truth to overcome entrenched policy? The answer is documented in files and statistics. 22 years passed between the First World War, when the Navy instituted racial restrictions, and Pearl Harbor, when Miller's actions contradicted those restrictions. 7 more years passed before President Truman ordered desegregation. 29 years of policy based on assumptions that evidence contradicted from the moment they were tested in actual combat. History offers no clean lessons, no simple morals. But it does offer evidence. And the evidence from Pearl Harbor, from the witness statements Lieutenant Commander Earl compiled in December 1941, from the photographs of Admiral Nimitz pinning the Navy Cross on a mess attendant's uniform, from the casualty lists showing ship's cook 3rd Class Miller lost at Tarawa, demonstrates a truth society struggle to accept. That the barriers we construct between people are typically more revealing about our own limitations than about the capabilities of those we exclude. Miller's story illustrates the cost of those barriers. 22 years old when he proved himself at Pearl Harbor, 24 when he died at Tarawa, he never lived to see combat ratings open to black sailors, never commanded a gun crew, never received the training his actions at Pearl Harbor demonstrated he could have mastered. The Navy honored him within limits, promoted him within constraints, recognized him without transforming the system that had restricted him, but the evidence he provided could not be contained. 15 witness statements became newspaper articles, became political pressure, became policy change. One mess attendant manning 2 guns for 15 minutes became proof that 4,000 black sailors could serve in any capacity. Individual heroism became collective argument. Personal courage became institutional transformation. The paradigm Miller shattered that morning at Pearl Harbor, the assumption that race determined military capability, fell slowly but completely. The mathematics were ultimately conclusive. 0 black sailors in combat roles in 1941. Thousands in combat roles by 1945. Tens of thousands by 1950. The capability was always present, only the opportunity changed. And with that change came recognition of a broader truth, that every human system based on categorical exclusion, every policy that prejudges individual capability based on group identity, every institutional barrier constructed around immutable characteristics will eventually collide with undeniable evidence of its falsity. The only questions are how long the collision takes, how much talent is wasted in the meantime, and whether institutions will adapt to evidence or cling to comfortable assumptions. Miller didn't live to see his vindication, but his example helped ensure that others would benefit from the truth he demonstrated under fire. That morning at Pearl Harbor, pulling wounded men from wreckage, manning guns he'd never been trained to use, remaining effective while his world burned around him, he became living proof that courage and capability transcend the categories societies construct. The Navy eventually acknowledged that truth. America eventually acknowledged that truth. The acknowledgement came too late for Miller, but his evidence helped force the reckoning that changed both institutions and the nation they served. The discovery Lieutenant Commander Earl made in December 1941, reading witness statements in a smoke-filled office at Pearl Harbor, was not really about one sailor's heroism. It was about the collapse of an entire framework of assumptions. The revelation that an institutional certainty held for decades was contradicted by 15 minutes of combat action. That discovery rippled outward through the Navy, through the military, through American society, forcing a transformation that Miller himself never witnessed, but his actions helped make inevitable. What seemed impossible on December 6, 1941, became undeniable on December 7th. And once undeniable, it became the foundation for change that transformed not just military policy, but the nation's understanding of justice, equality, and human potential. Miller's 15 minutes at the guns became evidence that accumulated into transformation. His life, cut short at Tarawa, became a question that demanded answers, a challenge to assumptions that eventually forced their own reconsideration. The museum preserves his Navy Cross, his photograph, his story. But what it really preserves is the evidence of what one person can reveal about the gap between institutional belief and human reality, between policy and truth, between the world as we insist it must be and the world as it actually is when tested by necessity. Miller forced that test on December 7, 1941. The evidence he provided continues to echo, asking whether we will wait for crisis to reveal truth or whether we might learn to see capability before necessity forces us to acknowledge it.